Looking ahead going into the 25-26 season, really this applies to the start of any season, but leading up to training camp, it's clear you have those teams that are at the top of the list and competing for a title, the strong up-and-coming teams that could conceivably make a deep playoff run, but not really quite there to win a championship. And then of course you got those teams that are going to be competing for the bottom of the standings, the tankers, the rebuilding teams looking to land a top draft pick. And then of course everything in between, with a fair amount of teams being in no man's land. And then you also have those handful of teams where you can't help but ask, what the hell are they doing and how could they have possibly set themselves up for such a bleak future? Not talking about this upcoming season, but beyond that, 3, 4, 5 years from now. And when you dig deep into the current state of those teams and their assets, their cap sheet, and current roster construction, you realize that things are actually much worse than you thought. And so in this video, we're going to be ranking the 5 teams with the worst outlook over the next 5 years based on a number of factors and criteria, and I would love to hear what you guys think as well. Be sure to subscribe if you like this type of content. I would love to get the channel to 100,000 subscribers before the end of the year. I would greatly appreciate it, and in return, I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, of course, there are a lot of ways one can measure the future outlook of a given franchise, and yes, in the NBA, we all know things can change drastically, both for good or bad, where you can get insanely lucky in the lottery like the Mavs did in landing Cooper Flag after trading Luka Doncic. Not suspicious at all, of course. Or you have a player that maybe didn't appear to have much potential but suddenly breaks out into a superstar. Or you could have the other end of the spectrum where a team that seemingly has one of the brightest futures in the league suddenly do an about-face where their young rising stars fall off in play or have career-altering injuries. So yes, I get that some of this is subjective when determining which franchises in the league have the worst outlook over the next 5 years, but when I think about a team's future, whether it's 3, 4, or 5 years out, I'm looking at 4 things, 4 factors that impact their future state. 1, what current stars do they have on their roster? 2, what players have future star or even superstar level potential, so not stars right now, but young players who haven't entered their prime yet, have shown that they have that kind of upside in the next few years. 3, how much draft capital they have at their disposal, because we all know draft capital is like currency in the NBA that can be used to package and trade deals or, of course, draft future talent. And then finally, what does their future cap sheet look like? What financial flexibility do they have that can allow for them to revamp their roster? And actually, I'll add a minor 5th factor in there, as it isn't as important but should be considered, is the team's historical standing and what they've done in recent years, even when they did have positive future assets. Again, what a team has done historically isn't necessarily an indication of how they'll be or what they'll do for the future, but something to think about. A team I often think about that falls into this category is the Charlotte Hornets, who have always had a good asset pool of draft capital, high lottery selections, and yet the team hasn't won a single playoff game, not a series, but a single playoff game since 2002. And so with these factors in mind, I'm going to start with number 5 on my list, all the way down on the team with the worst future outlook, ranking them in order from bad to worst. And at number 5 on the list, funny enough, it's actually the Charlotte Hornets. Now, to be fair to the Hornets, a team I have gone in on over the years for being an unserious franchise, the first time in a while, they have slowly started building their assets. They've got some nice young players to work with. I really like Brandon Miller. I think Con Knipple is going to be great for them. I think they'll eventually trade LaMelo and will be able to give a decent haul for him. But for me, just knowing this team, knowing the history of this organization, both in terms of the happenings on and off the court, I'm looking at things over the next 5 years, a team that doesn't have any clear franchise level players. And no, I do not think LaMelo Ball is that guy, even though I'm sure a lot of Hornets fans would disagree with me on that point. And what makes the situation even more difficult for the Hornets is that max contract they have for LaMelo on their books for the next 4 seasons for a player that can't stay on the court, and when he is on the court, isn't really impacting winning. So in my view, they've got to trade LaMelo before I take them off this list, otherwise their cap sheet isn't that clean, especially with Bridges being on the books for the next 2 seasons at $25 million per, Grant Williams on their books for the next 2 years, and of course, they're going to have to pay Brandon Miller soon. They're going to have to extend him, which is going to add more to their cap sheet starting in 2027. I wouldn't say this is a dire situation for the Hornets by any means, but it's not like this is a team that is flushed with extra first-round picks. They own all of their picks, which is great, but no current stars, really, as I don't consider LaMelo a star when he was a one-time All-Star 3 years ago and hasn't stayed healthy since then. Future stars, maybe Brandon Miller, but the jury is still out on that one since we didn't get to see much of him this past season. Their books aren't horrible, but could be better. What they do have going for them is their future draft capital, but the biggest downside is knowing the history of this team and how well they're going to be able to develop their talent going forward. At number 4, I've got the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, yes, the Bucks have Giannis. one of the greatest players in the league, consensus top 5 player in the NBA. Most people would have him in the top 3. And Giannis alone is the reason the Bucks aren't lower on this list, because if the Bucks really wanted to, even though they're not going to unless he demands it, but if they wanted to, they could make Giannis available in a trade and start a massive bidding war around the NBA that could net them a huge haul in the form of young players and draft capital that could kickstart a rebuild for the franchise. But even with that being said, keep in mind, Giannis is 30. It would be different if we were talking about a 26-year-old Giannis that they could really work with here for the foreseeable future. But outside of having a current superstar on their roster, it's looking extremely bleak for the Milwaukee Bucks. They had to waive and stretch Damian Lillard's contract, where they're now going to have dead money on their books for the next 5 years. A lot of dead money, by the way. $22.5 million per year they're going to have on their cap sheet for 5 years for a guy to not play on their team. They signed Miles Turner, who sure is a good pickup for them this offseason, but I don't think that makes them title contenders. And on top of that, they're going to be paying 16% of the cap over the next 4 years at $25 million to Miles Turner. They've got that bad contract to Kyle Kuzma on their books and a bunch of average to below average players in filling out their bench. So for the Bucks, one current star on their roster. I can't say anybody on their roster has future star potential. They're cap strapped from a payroll perspective for the foreseeable future. We're talking flirting with the second apron level cap strapped. And they have very limited draft capital, just one future first that they can trade, and no second round picks. That's a franchise 5 years from now I can see bottoming out in the East, and what makes it worse for them is they don't even have control of their future first round picks, where they have the ability to even go the tanking route and try rebuilding by way of getting a top pick when those picks are going to be going to other teams. At number 3 on the list, I have the New Orleans Pelicans, a team that is not only cursed from an injury standpoint, but a team that even when they are handed a bone, like landing Zion Williamson or given a mountain picks by trading for Anthony Davis, they just continue to make bad decision after bad decision. And to me, what really puts the Pelicans so low on this list of future outlook is the fact that Joe Dumars, who took over as the team's executive, decided it was a good idea to trade their 2026 pick unprotected to the Hawks just to move up a few spots in the 25 draft to select Derek Queen. A team that, even with Queen, even when Zion is healthy, even with DeJounte Murray is healthy, it's still very possible that they miss the playoffs and hand over a lottery pick, hell, even a top 5 pick to the Hawks based on how stacked the Western Conference is, and also knowing the likelihood of Zion and DeJounte Murray getting injured. That trade alone was baffling. But then also trading for Jordan Poole, who isn't going to be a good fit at all with DeJounte Murray or Jeremiah Fierce for that matter, who they drafted 7th overall. Herb Jones, who I like a lot, but they just recently extended him to a big contract. They signed Kevon Looney. I have no idea what this team is doing, because they're trying to be competitive. They're trying to win, because you don't trade that 2026 pick unprotected if you're not. I look at the factors I mentioned. They have one star currently on their roster in Zion, but a star who has consistently struggled with injuries. I personally don't think they have any current players with future star potential. I like Yves Missy, but I don't see a future all-star there. Maybe Jeremiah Fierce gets there, but too early to tell when we haven't seen him play in a single NBA game yet. The Pelicans' books are pretty tight with the contracts of Zion, Poole, Murray, both DeJounte and Trey for that matter. All big, long-term money that is going to be tough to move in the form of a trade. They're already a luxury tax team. They're projected to be over the cap for the next 3 seasons. And on top of that, they don't have their pick for next year, and they've shipped out most of their second round picks through 2029. Just not a good place to be if you're the Pelicans. At number 2, I've got the Phoenix Suns. And look, the only reason I don't have the Suns number 1 on this list for the worst future outlook over the next 5 years is the fact that they have Devin Booker, which I'm not saying that puts them in a positive space, but it is a big enough player, a big enough name that could land them a decent haul in the form of a trade. Although I don't even know if that will be true anymore given the obscene max contract extension they just gave him. And let's be real, given the Suns traded Kevin Durant, bought out Bradley Beal, they should have just torn the whole thing down and moved their most valuable trade asset in Booker. But we know that was never going to happen because Matt Ishbia has deluded himself into thinking this team can still compete. And, well, they kind of have to because they also owe all their first-round picks to other teams, most of them being unprotected. So, yes, the Suns do have a current star on their roster who is in his prime. While I'm not as high on Jalen Green, you could argue there is some star-level potential there. They traded for Mark Williams, who I like. They drafted Kaman Malawach, who I think is going to be a solid player for them. But their cap sheet is horrendous, especially when they have $19.4 million of dead money, dead Bradley Beal money, on their books for the next 5 years. They're an over-the-apron team that, as currently constructed, isn't a surefire thing to make the playoffs in the West, and they don't own any of their first-round picks until 2032, when Booker is going to be 36. It's going to be hard to try and build around Devin Booker when you don't own your picks and you don't have the financial flexibility to add talent around him. I think you're eventually going to get to a point in maybe 2 to 3 years from now, if not sooner, where Booker asks out in a trade, and by then his trade value has dropped from what it is today. But honestly, as bad of shape as some of these teams are when it comes to their future, nothing quite compares to the Sacramento Kings, a team who has finally seemed to turn things around somewhat when they made the playoffs for the first time in nearly 2 decades, but are right back to where they have been for years, except now it's even worse. After trading away their only star-level draft selections in Tyrese Haliburton and De'Aaron Fox, the Kings, for some odd reason, thought it would be a good idea to replicate what the Bulls did in 2021, something any person who watched the Bulls over the last 3 years knew was a horrible idea. But the Kings said, yeah, this will work. We'll make this work. To put DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine back together, except 4 years older than they were in 2021. And instead of getting a great return in a trade for their most valuable trade asset in Fox, we're going to turn that into Zach LaVine in a pick swap, while also handing the Bulls a couple second-round picks to bring in DeMar DeRozan in a sign-and-trade. The Kings have the max contracts of Sabonis and Zach LaVine on their books. By bringing in DeMar and Zach, it's not going to allow for the growth of Keegan Murray, which was very much needed for that franchise. They're not good enough to make the playoffs, yet their payroll reflects that of a contending team. They have limited draft capital, no players with future star-level potential, and some immovable contracts, which teams aren't going to be willing to give up assets to take on for Zach LaVine or DeMar DeRozan. Sabonis, they could likely get a solid return for in the form of a trade, but it's not going to be some insane haul when he's making over $45 million and is going to be turning 30 years old this upcoming season. And for me, and this goes back to what I was talking about with the Charlotte Hornets, given the history of this franchise, the level of incompetence at the highest levels, and seeing this being repeated right before our eyes, the history, the current state, the future assets, future financial commitments, nothing inspires confidence to say that the Kings will figure this out, and it's why I have them ranked number 1 as the team with the worst 5-year outlook in the NBA. I would love to hear what you guys think, though. You let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.